Together, we must turn ideas into action. Together, we must stay ahead of the threat. Today, we shape the next decade of cyber defence. Please welcome Chief Technical Officer for the National Cybersecurity Centre, Ollie Whitehouse.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good afternoon, and lovely to see you all. I've stood here in prior years and discussed various aspects of our collective journey, from the market failures that have led to the technological environment that we sit in, from how we sit in an age of autonomy with cyber-physical implications, through to how we must learn from the past to prepare for the future. And also how we need evidenced efficacy if we are to achieve our ultimate aims, and how we know more about what is in our sausages than in our software. And that's to date. So when we look at what we've seen in the last year, the risk, the threat continues to change. So firstly, we continue to see the commercial proliferation of capability to a wider range of actors. That is, bad actors able to acquire advanced capability and use it with intent. We've seen a significant number of intrusions stemming from security products having security vulnerabilities, and that is in 2026. We continue to see the rise of supply chain attacks, and specifically in the software supply chains, yielding 6-digit scale intrusions across organizations of all types. Organizations are wrestling with legacy while they try and build the AI future at the same time. The scale of state intrusions continues to become evident the better we become at defense, and the continued growth of AI in all of its guises. And I could go on for much, much longer. So what's changing the calculus on the threat? I think we've all seen the press over the last 10 days. But the latent vulnerability we knew about in our technological infrastructure is becoming extremely evident and extremely quickly. The complexity of technology is opaque to most, and specifically the vulnerability in that technology. And it's the expertise in rooms like this which needs to guide the vast proportion of organizations and the populations. Conversely, the race to adopt artificial intelligence to gain the competitive edge is also creating significant security issues for us to contend with. We saw this with Clawbot, and we've seen it with other instances where the technology itself is not being deployed in a way which is robust that we would recognize. AI is showing its efficacy at finding vulnerability and vulnerability at scale, to scale the human intent. And I think that's an important point. These are people wanting to use these technologies for both good and for bad to find it. And arguably the adoption of mature cyber defense practices is landing in a way which is uneven across broad swathes of the ecosystem. So the response required here is clear. We have a tension where we need to balance the short-term incentives with arguably our long-term intent. We need to act at a scale which we have never done before and at a pace. And we need to maximize the impact from technical expertise and evidence solutions if we're ultimately to achieve our aim. So when we look at some examples of how we may do that balancing, I thought it was worth to kind of break some down. So in the short term, we could see that in the immediacy, we're going to do a coordinated response to tactical vulnerability discovery as we go through this forced technical debt correction. In the long term, we should be moving to memory-safe languages and memory-safe technologies such as Cherry, but also demanding that technology vendors implement hot patching in a way which is universally understood and appreciated. We are not going to be able to survive in a world if we need to restart everything to patch every vulnerability. That just will simply not be tenable in a whole range of situations. So the pervasive arrival of hot patching will be key. The next is, we can obviously prepare for crisis and recovery planning and build the good resilience principles that we would like. But really, what we're having to go after in the longer term is a legislative framework, a set of regulations, and a set of market incentives that ultimately underpin what we want. We can define minimum standards and we can measure compliance against it, but really creating a world where innovation and above-bar behavior in terms of cybersecurity is deeply rewarded in the market is ultimately the aim. And then when we get really reductive, we can think about cycles as being 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years, or we can think intergenerationally. We are the leaders, we are the practitioners at a moment in time where we are dealing with great technological disruption and change. How will we be judged based on the decisions that we made now? And if we're being kind to those that will ultimately assume these roles, we need to think about this very clearly. So our ability to plan and execute over the long term is going to be deeply required, which is, at times challenging because of the delayed rewards. But to help us kind of think about that, NCSC works with a broad range of institutions and communities in order to think about what that future may look like. And so we've been supported by the Research Institute for Socio-Technical Cybersecurity to think around this. And there was a short story competition looking at what the future may actually look like. And I'm very happy to say that the winner of the short story competition by Lefke Carantoni, titled The Wednesday Afternoon Fishing Club, and without any spoilers, the story shines a light on how new technology could actually be a positive change for good. It allows us to explore that future and actually understand and actually have an aiming point that we can go after with some gusto. So when we look at that scaling challenge and actually how we get after it, we can look at it organisationally, we can look at it sectorally, we can look at it nationally. But the important point also, we're going to need it internationally. I used a line this morning with a group of individuals, which is, we need all boats to rise. The world, we are not a figurative digital island. We need the globe to stand up with us and actually raise their level of resilience and the quality of the ultimate technology. We need to identify solutions that change the game and drive an asymmetric benefit for cyber defense. A good example being the work that we've done around cyber deceptions. So if I give some examples. So today we have early warning. Today we have share and defend. Today we more broadly have active cyber defense. What are we working on? We've talked about the work that we're doing in identity and access management and specifically passkeys. We need to be thinking about the work that we need to do for the agentic era. How will agents have identity? How will identity and access management work in that world? Architectures, we know the primitives are critical. An example there is privileged access workstations for CNI. It is an immutable architectural primitive which we know works. When we look at migration away from legacy technology, we have the post-quantum crypt transition coming and coming quickly. When we look at standards and the work that we're doing there around security operations centers and more broadly around within ETSI, around memory safety, all of these are laying the foundations for those long-term benefits. But we also must maximize the impact from our technical expertise. So radical transparency. There is nothing to be embarrassed about in terms of cybersecurity, although lawyers may coach us otherwise. The reality is we need organizations to be able to share across that organizational boundary with confidence to build the kind of collective defense, and technology vendors to be as transparent as they can and they are comfortable around what constitutes their technology and the quality of the processes which underpin it. Engineering resilience is also critical here. So actually, how do we engineer in resilience that actually minimizes the blast radius of intrusions when they actually manifest? Again, when we look at what we are doing around cross-domain, we are bringing technologies and concepts from our work in the classified space to the wider CNI space. The reason we do that is we know those architectural approaches work and those technologies have a long, trusted pedigree within the community. And then, as we think about this, agentic AI for cyber defense. And you would have heard the security minister talk about the National Cyber Shield. How we bring real-time red and blue agents that are able to probe and, more importantly, mitigate vulnerability at scale across a national picture is ultimately where we get to. So I'd like to close out that beyond kind of AI and its cyber physical manifestation, we still haven't learned from the past. In the last year, we've seen numerous examples of emerging robotics platforms in the consumer space that have the vulnerabilities of the last 20 years. And if we do not get this right, it will be a compounding effect. So we have time, but we don't have limitless time. We have choices, but we don't have infinite choices. And ultimately, we have a duty which is enduring. So I will close out by saying we do need to balance the short term and the long term. And that's going to be a tension that we have to hold. We've got to act at a pace and a scale that we are not used to. And finally, how we maximize the impact from deep technical expertise and evidence solutions through the next period is going to be what's critical. And with that, I'd like to thank you as we move to the panel session. So thank you very much. And I'd like to invite onto the stage our panel members, please, to join me. Thank you very much. Hey, Barbara. Well, I'm extremely proud and pleased to have this panel. We have an exemplary set of participants. So before we jump into the questions, I'd like to kind of zip down the line, please, and very briefly in 30 seconds or so, introduce yourself and your illustrious careers, if you can, if that's indeed possible. So Barbara, please, may I start with you?
I'm Barbara Gruey. My background is as a lawyer and national security professional. I was a senior counsel on the 9/11 Commission, and then took that experience to MITRE, where I worked on implementing the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission, but then transferred into cybersecurity and doing cyber risk management for the government of Japan. And then currently a visiting scholar at Jesus College, Cambridge, where I'm doing research into a new framework for the government's approach to cybersecurity.
Thank you. Jamie, please.
I'm Jamie McCall. I was a professional musician for about 15 years, and then I saw the DCIT advert about moving into cyber, the famous one with the ballet dancer, and I thought I'll do that instead. Slightly rewriting history, but I am a senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in the cyber and tech team, where I lead our work on UK cyber policy.
Thank you. And finally, Catherine.
And you need to know that also Jamie backstage was saying that the last time you were in Glasgow was for a gig. But this is way better. What could be better than Cyber UK? My name's Catherine Day. I'm basically a biological anthropologist, which means that the way in which I look at the world is through the lens of how well set up we are to survive and thrive. I also spent 25 years in government, mainly working on national security and international stuff, and left last year because it took me too long to realize that this is not a rational way to run a country or to run a species, actually, to be human and to survive in the world today. So in my new chapter, I'm dedicated to figuring out a different way of doing it. And I've co-founded something called the National Strategy Project, which is creating a different way for large groups of people, a country, to think, to decide, and then to act together.
Thank you. So there are, I think we all recognize that to make big changes, be it in technology, in process or similar, takes time. And it's always really tempting to kind of put those off and focus on the near term. So Barbara, I'd like to turn to you first and say, what lessons can we learn from outside our cyber echo chamber? And what actions can we take now that will shape the trends, the policies, and the technology evolution for the next decades in your experience?
So the question of this panel is in the future looking back, but I think we need to start looking back at this point in time. Winston Churchill said those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And so I'd like to go back to some of the findings of the 9/11 Commission, where they identified 4 specific failures in the government prior to the attacks. These were a lack of imagination, failure of policy, failure of capabilities, and failure of management. So for imagination, the government took the threat seriously, but did not muster the effort that you would expect against a first, second, or even a third rank enemy. In policy failures, We either didn't have the policies in place, or even worse, we had an information sharing policy from the Attorney General that people in the government just flaunted and ignored. We had the lack of capabilities. We were trying to address the al-Qaeda threat with institutions that had been around since the Cold War. And then we had failures of management. Decisions were made independently. The CIA and FBI didn't think they were on the same team. We didn't have unity of effort. So how does this apply in the cyber realm? Well, all of these issues still apply in government. But let's think about how everyone, and many at this conference, are saying that cybersecurity is a national security, economic security issue. But what does that mean in practice? So if our foreign adversary sent an intercontinental ballistic missile against our critical infrastructure, the national government would stand up and say, our job. You don't have to build an iron dome over your business or your company, or in fact, your home. Yet when these foreign adversaries use a different kind of weapon that could have the same or even greater consequences, the government says, it's on you. We have effectively ceded national security and economic security to the CISOs and the boards of companies looking for profits. So for example, if you looked at Jaguar Land Rover, do you think the board, when they're making decisions about their cyber activities, considered the fact that an attack against that company might take 2.9 percentage points off the country's GDP? Probably not. Or all of those people who have the outdated routers and cable boxes that the foreign adversary used to put malware on the critical infrastructure in the US and elsewhere, do you think that they thought, yeah, I'm not going to spend money on a new router. It may have an impact on national security, but I don't really care. They didn't think about it. Yet those vulnerabilities had huge impact on our national security. So we have to think about how do we have a completely different mindset, how cybersecurity fits into national security and economic security, and create a new framework for that approach that will, in fact, make national security and economic security issues back in the realm of the national government. We don't need a lot of imagination for what is going to happen to us. We know who the opposition is, we know what they're capable of, and we actually know how they do it. We didn't have that for 9/11. So do we have any excuse for not stopping it now?
Thank you very much. Catherine, Jamie, would you like to build on any of that?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this yesterday as Richard was opening his speech and talking about the analogy of when he was driving in the rain and there was a terrible storm and he realized that he had a responsibility as a driver to drive safely and so did all the other drivers on the road. But I think when thinking about that as an analogy for how we manage cyber risk, there's a missing actor that's responsible in that, which is the manufacturer of the cars that everyone on that road is driving. Because over time, we developed safety and security standards that every car manufacturer had to meet, or what we'd consider minimum security controls like seatbelts. It still feels like we are very far away from that with enterprise IT in terms of shifting some of that responsibility and liability onto vendors and manufacturers. And I think if you look at the history of most technologies or industries, that is not an unsolvable problem, but it does take, I guess, political will and people caring about it enough to change it. And I think we do have a bit of a tendency to treat tech and IT as if it's something unique, but all these problems have been solved before.
Thank you. Catherine, anything on that?
Yes, so I think two things. I think that with Barbara, you have heard the most important thing that each of us has to walk away with. I don't want to see another report ever that says there's been a failure of imagination. I think it's completely wonderful that you've started this short story competition, that you've got a musician on the panel, that you're getting us to engage creatively with some of the stuff that we all do and have all shared responsibility for. I don't think that we ever have the imagination that we need, really. The future, the only thing we can be certain of is that the future is going to look completely different to what it does now. At the same time, I think that there is a lot of truth in hardly any crisis. I can't think of a crisis over my 25-year career in government that was actually a surprise. They've all been foreseen one way or another, but what we have lacked successively, and I wish we would learn from it, is the imagination and the discipline to think through what that means and to get our house in order. The second thought that I had, just sparking off what you said, Barbara, is do we actually know who the adversary is? Because I'm really struck in the world today where more and more of us are spending more and more of our lives in cyberspace, and we're seeing our basic ability, our basic human ability to think, be eroded. So I have 16-year-old and 8-year-old daughters. Do we actually know who the adversary is? And is there something about how we ourselves as a society are becoming a little bit of a problem if we let this keep on going unfettered? Because I see a huge erosion in our cognitive resilience and in our ability to engage critically. So I'd love us to think about that too.
Thank you very much. So Jamie, turning to you, we've got a lot of burning issues right now. I think it's fair to say. How should we balance that short and long-term action in your view?
Yeah, we do have a lot of burning issues. I think it's very hard at the moment to know who to choose to listen to, who is right when predicting future outcomes. I mean, look at the news around Mythos and AI over the last week or two. It's just a constant flood or tsunami of information. Some of it fact, some of it marketing, some of it hype. And I think in those kinds of situations, ultimately government does have quite an important role in sitting above that and actually making an assessment about, over the longer term, where do the greatest risks lie, what sort of guidance should they be giving, and how do they shape the kind of conditions in which organisations make decisions.
Thank you. Catherine, Barbara, anything to build on that?
So I would love to reflect on the culture that I've seen over my time in government of this learned dependency on government, which I think is a particular issue in this country. And just speaking to the point of, somebody somewhere will have foreseen some sort of problem, but this might not have bubbled up through the system. I would love us to flip that culture of learned dependency so that if we spot an issue, oh my goodness, we have a responsibility to act on it and to persist and to make sure that action gets taken on it. So there's a cultural thing there that I think that we need to turn around. We've become far too used to blaming others and shifting off responsibility rather than taking it for ourselves.
Yeah, and we definitely have conversations internally, and the coaching I give the teams as well is, it is not about what we achieve and our careers. It is about the legacy we build and iteratively build for the next. And so some of this longer term stuff requires people to be almost selfless. And sometimes that isn't a natural behavior that comes to people in terms of the incentive structures in which they operate.
If I might just
Please.
add quickly, I think it's important that the team have both firefighters and visionaries.
Yep.
You have to have both, but you have to realize if the house burns down, that's a problem.
Yes.
So you want to stop things before the house burns down. But how we address fires, I think we have to be strategic about it and have agreement as to what the effort should be and how we should do it, so that we do it within a framework as opposed to just randomly oh, I see 5-alarm fire there, I'm going to throw all the water there, and not think about, oh, I got another one over here. And so we have to think about priorities, triage, all of that.
So Catherine, thank you for that, Barbara. So Catherine, turning to you, you know, you have a unique position. You've had a unique career, I think, from where you sat within the Cabinet Office. Why is it hard for big organisations to make kind of evidenced long-term decisions? And specifically, why is it so challenging for governments in your experience, please?
Thank you, Ollie. A big question. We simply haven't set ourselves up from where I'm sitting as a society or in government to be able to look at the long term. And there is a big systemic component to this, but also a really, really human component, the culture and the mindset that just comes naturally to humans, how humans are, drives us towards the short term. So I grew up in Northern Ireland, height of the Troubles, so lived every day with the experience of state failure, basically. We were terrified. You know, at school there were bomb threats every week. And that really brought home to me how much we take for granted as a society and how little thought we collectively give to, right, okay, you know, well, what do we do in the long-term public interest? And it's why I came into government in the first place, actually. I was curious about that. Surely, if any part of our society bore responsibility for the long term, it would be our great civil service, our great public service dedicated to the public interest. What I realized, and it took me 25 years to realize it, is that we have built a system in which the incentives are inherently short-term. We have made it impossible for ourselves, the way in which we've set up the UK, with our 5-year political cycles, with our politically led system, to take decisions that can reliably stick over the long term. So my first answer to this question is we have to address that. We have to recognize this gap and come together to fill it, to build that organization that is responsible for the long term and that does hold the long term. I think this looks different to anything that we've got right now. I want to talk about the culture and the mindset here as well, because over 25 years on and off, I've advised the last 8 prime ministers and cabinets one way or another. And you serve up decisions to these people who are just people, amazing people. They've stuck at it to get into those positions, but people with the limited life experience that we each have, they know what they know. Very often they're thrust into these positions of taking huge and consequential decisions that might cause them to either win or not have as much capability to win a coming election. You know, government investment in resilience isn't much fun. There's not much that you can show for it unless a pandemic comes along. Largely, that sort of investment is measured in what doesn't happen rather than what does. So our culture, our mindsets, the people at the heart of this system, we haven't incentivized us to think properly about the long term. We don't have a culture beyond government that encourages that. I mean, goodness, just look at the papers this last week, who'd put themselves in that line of fire. Until we shift those things. And that I see basically as a function of leadership. We can't expect to be thinking long term.
Jamie, and if I ask the same question to you from your interactions with the private sector and the work that you've been doing in ransomware, what are you seeing at tensions here? Why are organizations really struggling to kind of deal with that long-term consideration?
I mean, I do think with cybersecurity specifically, we have a really long-standing problem with the kind of lack of evidence, data, metrics against which we can assess what works and what doesn't work. So as an organization, how do I prove return on investment in particular cybersecurity controls? That's one of the reasons why I enjoyed a talk by Daniel Woods, who's a researcher at the University of Edinburgh earlier, because he is actually doing proper research into like what is the evidence around specific cybersecurity controls. And I think similar problems exist for vendors as well in terms of, like what's the market advantage I gain from investing in security and how do I evidence that to senior decision makers. And then I think government has many of the same problems as well in terms of assessing the effectiveness of different policies. As you say, I work predominantly on ransomware policy. It's very hard for me, based on the evidence and data we have about ransomware in the UK, to say on a given year, are we doing a better or worse job? There's no mandatory reporting. And then I think there's another phenomenon I find with government, based on my experiences with the civil service, of people rotating through jobs, and you see this when you've worked in the same policy area for a long time. If you're on a kind of 2 to 3 year rotation, there doesn't seem to be a culture of learning from what people have tried to do before, because most of the ideas we have, someone has thought about at some point and has tried to implement it. But there's no institutional memory of why did someone else try this and fail, and how do I learn from that? How do I go and find that person and speak to them?
And so it's like, how do we build the incentive structures that iterative improvement is celebrated as much as the big idea?
Yeah, I think so. And it's also just as basic as like, we should write things down somewhere in terms of what we've tried.
I may lose my value if I Barbara, please.
Well, I think both of your points just show that government is actually reactive and not proactive. There's just not the incentives to say, I'm going to invest money on the chance that this is what's going to happen in the future, so I want to prevent that. Yet, waiting until 3,000 people are dead, or until our critical infrastructure, we have riots in the street because there's no water, there's no power, we can't do that. And so we have to, in fact, do some kind of research into what is most likely, using our imagination, of the things that we need to really worry about, and what are some things that can probably help with that. And we just have to be able to take that leap and just say, I'm doing it even though it may not be the right thing, but it's better than doing nothing.
Okay, so moving us on, there's often a question on, should a government be overly interventionist, or should it allow the free market to free market? And so the question to all of you, and I'll throw it open and we'll go down the line, is, what is the role of government really in driving technology change? What should government be doing here? What is our role versus what should the private sector or the customer be driving?
Well, I think the thing is that we have to have, you talked about rising all boats. We have to get the water level sort of even for everybody, and so that there's a minimum. Let them innovate past that, but if we've got CEOs or in the business world, or we've got individual citizens, or we've got people in government who are making decisions that are based on things other than what's best for the community or the world, as you talked about internationally, it's the economist in me, externalities.
Yep.
Here it is. The biggest externalities. And so what you need to have is at least a minimum set of standards that gets everybody to a particular point, and then let the innovation go above. So you talked about the automotive situation. None of the manufacturers wanted to do seatbelts because they weren't going to do it on their own, because it costs money, and it put them in a competitive disadvantage. But when you said everyone had to have seatbelts, then it got done.
Okay, very good. Catherine, can I come to you next? What should the role of government be in driving technological change or technology change?
I'm going to talk about the role of government in driving any change, actually, because with technological change, I see that as being like any sort of societal change. And there are real limits to what government can do. This is the biggest lesson I take from experiencing Boris Johnson's integrated review of foreign defence, security, etc. Policy. What government can do is limited. But what it can do, oh my goodness, it can act as the catalyst for the human group that is our country to face the realities. It can talk loudly about the realities and explain the realities. And that's something that I've seen us become increasingly bad at, not helped by the media environment. But this is such an important role, which actually the NCSC fulfills brilliantly in the cyberspace, calling out those realities, making people confront them. The second thing that I think government can do is enable and support the rest of society to adapt, shout about our shared responsibility, help us to see that. But really, this isn't something that it can command and control. And one of the risks that I've seen over my career is that what we expect of government doesn't quite match that. We too often expect government to solve things for us. And actually, it can catalyse, it can enable, it can lead the way. But really, ultimately, its role is to make sure that this group of people survives and thrives and to do everything to make that possible.
Thank you.
And there is a collective investment thing in there as well. But actually, I don't think I think that too often drives how we talk about government, and it shouldn't dominate.
Jamie?
I mean, I don't think government should be driving the development of technology or innovation more generally, but I do think we do have sort of 20 plus years evidence now that waiting on private markets to improve cybersecurity and resilience has just, like, frankly not worked. Like, we're just having the same conversations over and over again. I was recently rereading a lot of the older UK national cybersecurity strategies, and they basically all say the same thing about market failure, and we're still in the same place, 17 years after the first one. So I do think ultimately the role of government is just it's not necessarily to always directly intervene in technology markets, but just to shape that minimum baseline and the conditions in which companies make decisions.
Okay, really good. Okay, so kind of bringing us home on the home straight, we've got the easy question last, which is, what would you like to see changed in the next decade? So if you're sitting where I'm sitting, or you're sitting where ultimately decision makers are, if we really want to achieve our aims, which is to have a cyber resilient, confident country that can adopt technology at pace, what are the changes that we're going to need to see over that decade? What would evidence that to you? Who's going to be brave enough to go first on the massively open-ended question, which we will all be judged and marked on at some point in the future?
I vote for the magic wand. You and I have had a chance to talk about this privately, about how do we rethink the relationship between government and industry and even the citizenry, and think about what kind of things indicate where government should intervene and where it should step back. And I don't think that there's an easy answer to that, but I think we can come up with criteria that allows the government to say, okay, this is where there's market failures, we need to correct for the market failures. We don't want to stifle the markets. But I think it's really coming up with a joint understanding of that shared responsibility and who has what responsibility. But I also think it really means that government does have to step up. Not that it's the answer to everything, I agree with you on that. But there are ways it has to step up. It has to use imagination. It has to set the policies. It has to have management. You have to have unity of effort. And that unity of effort is not only within a single government, but it has to be internationally, because it doesn't work if you're just in your own little ecosystem.
Thank you. Jamie?
I mean, this is more of a specific thing, I think maybe just I've been thinking about in relation to Mythos in particular, but having an open source software ecosystem that is properly maintained and secured and supported by government and larger vendors is something that I think will be essential if we're to survive the next decade. And then I think another area is, I think Kieran Martin has been speaking very compellingly over the last year or so about the need to treat resilience, cyber resilience, in the same way that we do data protection, and that it being a essential part of how every organisation in this country does business. And I think if we could reach that point in the next 10 years, that would also be...
And what do you think it will take to achieve that? Because I don't think anyone disagrees that's got to be the end state. What do you think is not true today that needs to be true for business to treat it in that way?
I mean, we had to legislate and regulate data protection in the end. Sorry, I realise this whole panel is going to come across as very pro-government, but
No.
sorry.
Catherine.
I'll do my best to level up. Right, I think three things. Firstly, the question you gave us for this panel, Ollie, is brilliant and is one thing that I hope everybody walking out of here will think about. What will our future selves thank us for having done now? Because ultimately, on an individual level, that's what we'll each leave behind, and that's what life needs to be about. The second thing, I think, is that we need to see equal and opposite investment in what happens when everything switches off, because that's going to happen. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And as anyone who has experienced a cyber attack, your next panel is going to have the brilliant Kerry on it, and we were talking about her experience of this, will know. We need, as humans, to be just as able to survive and thrive in a world without any technology or without technology operating as we are in the world in which we operate. We take all of this for granted at our peril. The third thing, I think, actually comes from another backstage conversation with another of the CyberUK team who said, look, I just don't want to come back here again and be asking people to act again by this time next year, let alone in 10 years' time. I want us to have done what it takes to make this society to survive. So my one thing is please go away from here and plan for that offline world. Be ready for it, because that's what we need most of all.
And as someone that went through the streaming media outage of 2025 in my household and the absolute disarray that then resulted, I deeply sympathise with that. So, closing thoughts, please, because it's easy to say, what would we do now that our future versions of ourselves or future iterations of ourselves would thank ourselves for? But that isn't, I think, Catherine, as you've alluded to, that doesn't come natural to the human species, I guess. So how do we create, and I appreciate you're not prepared for this question, but how do we create the incentive structure? How do we create the kind of the cultural anchor where people will work for future custodians of these roles and for society as a whole? What do we think needs to be true there? Is it a communications problem? Is it a societal cohesion problem? Is it a community cohesion challenge? What is it? Catherine, can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. So I think two things. Firstly, it's not going to feel happy and comfortable, if you're thinking and acting on what we've just been talking about. It's going to take courage, and it's going to take change. And this isn't going to be back to work, take it easy, carry on as usual. So that's the first thing, I think, and let's just be ready for that and support each other through that. The second thing, I think, which builds on that, is that above all, this is going to take extraordinary leadership. And I see leadership as being something completely different to management. Management is about keeping our organizations going. Leading them is about taking them into a future that we haven't yet created and that we're part of creating. And that's how we can build within ourselves and across our organizations and in our country and species the courage to do the stuff that has to be done. And this is particularly important because what I see at the moment, especially in this country, but not exclusively in this country, is a crisis of leadership. This isn't something that we think about every day. What does it take to lead a nation? What's my part? Each of us has a part in this. What's my part in making this country, this organization, this community I'm part of a little bit better? So maybe that's the first step. Let's go away and think about that.
Jamie,
and act on it.
Thank you, Catherine. Any closing thoughts from you, Jamie?
I think we need a stronger shared national mission on this than we currently have. I mean, I travel a lot to Eastern Europe and Scandinavia and places like Taiwan for my job, and there's a much greater collective sense of preparing for the worst. And maybe that's just because they literally are geographically closer to Russia and China, but I think there's also something perhaps deeper within society that we have not managed to redevelop in recent years.
Barbara, last 30 seconds of closing.
Yeah, well, I think the fact we can't rely on individuals to do what's best for everybody, because again, we're talking externalities. So let's go to the British law that said IoT manufacturers have to make it so people can't use bad passwords, because we kept telling everyone, no bad passwords, and they said, yeah. And so the government finally said, okay, we're going to make it so you just can't use bad passwords. So I think we have to create structures that make it so people behave in ways that are for the collective good, and we can't count on them to do it on their own.
Ollie?
Yes, please, Catherine.
Sorry, very disruptive, this
No.
beautifully managed panel, but I wanted to riff off what Jamie said, because that, I think, is the most important thing I've heard in this panel, and what a fantastic challenge to us as a community, by this time next year, to have shaped our first ever, genuinely cross-sector national mission around cyber resilience. I think if we could do that, tremendous.
Excellent. So hopefully what you've heard here is, and to borrow a phrase from a previous chief exec of mine, it's just us. No one else comes and does this for us. So how we bond together and ensure that the long-term outcomes that we seek are achieved, there's no one going to do this for us. It is this group, and it starts hopefully here. So we'll take Jamie's challenge and try and cohere a country in 12 months, or not. So please join me in thanking the panel for their contributions. We're now going to do a small transition because they need to reorientate the stage before Carolyn comes on to announce some winners, and then the big boss gets to finish the conference. So thank you very much, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real privilege to be here to announce the winner of this year's CyberDen competition. Before we look to this year's winner, it's worth remembering the previous winners. Last year's CyberDen champions, MindGuard, were recognised for their innovation in tackling the challenge of cyber attacks on AI. A year on, their momentum has only grown. Their CEO, Peter Garrigan, recently published a paper on practical approaches to mitigating cyber attacks on AI systems, describing approaches to protecting data, pipelines and models, and the decisions they influence, even when the pressure is high and the signals are noisy. So what is the prize? The winner will receive 12 months of support from the NCSC to help assess, develop and pilot their product or service. This may include consultancy on the technology, targeted vulnerability research, and the potential to work with a government department to test the deployment of their product or service. The winner will also receive mentoring sessions with the NCSC CTO, Ollie Whitehouse, and the NCSC Growth Team. Before we reveal our winner, I want to recognise the breadth and quality of entries we saw this year. We had ideas spanning practical cyber hygiene for organisations, through to capabilities providing enhanced OT security and cyber training. Other entries covered cyber defence and user support, from network threat detection to AI-driven everyday guidance. As you can see, the variety was impressive, and it made judging genuinely difficult. So to the judges, thank you for your time and the rigour and fairness you brought to every score and every review. And to every participant, you should be proud. It takes courage to put your skills on the line, to present in public, and to communicate a concept and its value to cybersecurity clearly and in a very short space of time. You all rose to that challenge. By building innovation and capacity in the sector, you're helping strengthen our collective cybersecurity. As you've heard over the last 2 days, that's an ever-increasing challenge, and one that is crucial to all of our safety and prosperity. So now the moment you've all been waiting for. This year's winner was chosen because they present a unique opportunity to upskill OT engineers in cybersecurity, which is a material gap today. The winner of the CyberDen Competition 2026 is Hackatronics, the OT cybersecurity training platform. Congratulations, and please will you join me in giving them a massive round of applause. And now, can I introduce the CEO of the NCSC and my boss, Richard Horn.
So hi everyone, we've saved the best till last. An amazing panel to end with. One of the things we wanted to do with CyberUK this year was bring some different perspectives from outside the cybersecurity industry that we could all learn from. And we've got two amazing people to talk in the next panel about a topic that we don't talk about enough. And that is how we lead and how we prepare our organizations for traumatic situations, for crises, because they're a fact of life in our industry. And so it's a real honor to have Kerry Gilder from Colt, the CEO of Colt Communications, and Els de Buff from the International Committee of Red Cross, who, in case anyone doesn't know, spend their entire lives in war zones, helping people, bringing aid, meeting prisoners, bringing some compassion and some humanity into the most horrible situations on the planet. And so we're really privileged to be able to learn from Kerry's experience and bring the totally different perspective from Els of how you prepare people for those kind of situations. So, Kerry, is there anything else you'd add for your introduction?
The only thing I would add is quite relevant to this audience. My company did have a massive cyber attack back in August of last year, and my experience is what I'll be talking about today.
Brilliant. And else? Anything?
Well, I think I'm good to go. I'm going to listen to Kerry and see what it brings up for us. Thank you.
So, Kerry, August 2025. Tell us about it.
It's a bit of a blur, if I'm completely honest. So we were hit with a major cyber attack. It was a Microsoft security incident, and I got the call from my CISO that basically said we need to get on a crisis call right away. So we did. And what I realized in the first 30 seconds of that call was that this crisis was very different from any other crisis that we've dealt with. And we deal with crisis all the time. We have fiber cuts, we have fires, we have floods, we deal with these quite often. So I was used to getting up in the middle of the night, having those conversations. But this one felt very different. And the reason that it felt different was because it was an attack on us. And that felt very strongly throughout the organization, throughout the leadership. In the first 24 hours, what became apparent is that our collaborative decision-making and cultural environment that we had to move from that collaboration to command and control. And that was really uncomfortable for many of us because it wasn't our normal mode of operandi. And so when we moved to that, what I also realized is that even though people's day job is very clear and people are very good at it, sometimes in those moments, they kind of forget what they do. And so in that environment, once again, in the first 24 hours, whether it is the CISO or it's the head of IT or it's your head of HR, there is almost this requirement to remind your leaders what their job is. And I found that quite surprising in that environment because I have very senior leaders, they know what their job is. But the sense of shock that you get when you understand that all of the systems in your entire company are now down and the impact that it has on the business, the shock of that is felt so deeply that you can freeze, and there is an element of really not knowing what to do next.
Wow. And you've talked about staff sort of experiencing genuine trauma, even sort of PTSD, burnout, even months after the incident. It's like, when did you first realize the human cost of what you were going through?
So I think the first 3 weeks, so just to put it into perspective, we made the decision within moments of the attack happen to shut down 4,000 servers across our entire business. That in and of itself is a very difficult decision to make. Number one, you're shutting down your entire business. Number two, we had to turn up 248 manual processes within 24 hours. So your BCDR process written down on paper needs to be quite good because paper is all you have to rely on at that particular point. So I think it was the realization of having to run the business manually for a very long time. And we ran the business manually for almost 3 months. And the first 3 weeks were a bit of a blur, if I'm completely honest. You're just going through the motions, doing what needs to be done. I found myself in a really strange situation after 3 weeks of doing all-hands calls with my entire company. And we did these initially every day, and then we moved to about three times a week by the time the third week came around. I had worn the same T-shirt and the same pair of jeans for 3 weeks in every single call. And it was clean. I had multiple of them. but I recognized this, and I thought, wow, I didn't even realize that I am picking the same shirt and the same pair of jeans, and I'm putting those on every day. But it was because I had decision fatigue. And so I couldn't actually handle a clothing decision that was completely minor with all of the major decisions that I was having to make throughout the day. Yeah. And so I think that was probably the first realization of there's going to be a human, a physical, a health, a well-being impact to possibly me personally. But then probably eight weeks to 3 months in, what I started to see is we were working people around the clock, and we were starting to see some major health issues. People were going, to hospital. They were having major problems. We were fortunate enough that we recognized it early enough so that we did put a timeout on the business, even though it didn't mean the restoration would be stalled. But we had to do that because we saw a breaking point in people.
Yeah, amazing, thank you. Else, completely different environment, but what resonated with you in what Kerry's been saying?
I've given up very early in my career on the clothing choices. I think a few points that resonate are the intense work pressure that you're under when you're in a crisis.
Yeah.
And that is, unfortunately, for the people that work with us and in the situations where we're a pretty daily reality. And perhaps then what's different as well is that we have that often for a very long time, like, okay, for all the time that you work for the organization. Sometimes you get to be in Luxembourg, like I'm right now. It gives a bit of a pause. It's a bit of a different vibe. But people are exposed to this over a long time. So you could think maybe we're more used to it. And it does bring a bit more perspective because we're also doing that where people's lives are really messy. So somehow it's also a little bit like, okay, my situation is not that bad. But that can also be dangerous. Because while you might get used to it a little bit and get a different perspective, you also have that long-term exposure to human suffering around you, to seeing people really bad things, but at the same time a lot of stress all the time. So that can also come with a different type of strain. So that's perhaps a little bit different. But these moments, but even if we do, you could say like it's a constant crisis, but in that we really have crisis moments. It could be a cybersecurity attack, and we've also been victim to that. It can be a kidnapping situation. It could be just the rise in a conflict. I mean, I've worked 4 years in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. It's conflict all the time. But when you have something like 2021, which probably most people won't remember because then we've had 7 October 2023, these are then moments that we manage as crisis moments as well within a crisis. So that intensity of pressure of work, that need to make decisions on the spot and to make decisions that are both about your business continuity. So we would call it like we need to continue our operations, right? We can't stop operations. I mean, that's where we're there for, to help these people in conflict situations. So if it gets worse, we can't leave. But then you also have to take care of your staff. And balancing that together with the short-term crisis management and the long-term impact that's going to have in the way you manage that crisis on your capacity to operate, on your business model, if you want. Those things, they come also with increased pressure. I think what also resonates is that you mentioned it, Kerry, you need to make decisions to keep the business going. We need to make decisions to operate. It's not like, okay, there's gunfire around us, you can go home and take a rest. No, I mean, that's what you came here for. So how do you manage that? And every decision that we make in those moments are going to have a human impact on people's lives, on people's dignity, on their security, both our own people and the people that we're there to serve. And so it comes with a sort of weight of decision that I also detect in what you were saying. So it's not just urgency, it's also responsibility, and it can be quite a lot to bear.
And one thing you've talked about that's been fascinating and sort of really resonated with both of us is sort of your years in humanitarian crises. You've seen people behave differently in crisis situations than they do in sort of calm situations. And I think and how do you know, or what do you do when you find that some people who you wouldn't expect are amazing and some people who you wouldn't expect actually kind of fall apart a bit in those situations? How do you navigate that as a leader?
A lot is about preparation and awareness. Not only awareness of the risks that you're going to be exposed to, but on the fact that that can do something to you, and that when a crisis hits, some people are, more cool-headed than others, and you can see that in daily life. Like if you have a car accident, or if you break a glass, or whatever, it can be something different. Some people are more cool-headed than others. It's good to know that about yourself. But it's also important to know that sometimes in a crisis, people who are usually quite cool-headed could totally freeze. And then other people who are perhaps you would never expect to lead or to manage or to be brave or whatever, and then suddenly they rise up and they can do that. And I think it's important as well, because we talk a lot about preparedness and preparing leaders, but you also need to be able to see what's happening and adapt and say like, well, maybe this is normally your job, but like if you don't feel okay with this is also an important point. It's okay walk away. Yeah. It's better to walk away from your job right now. You're not going to lose it, but if you think right now it's not going to work out for you, you could put yourself in danger, you could put other people in danger, you could put the organization in danger. So if you need a break, if you need to do something different in this situation, that's okay. And we'll have your back, because we will make sure that we have people that can step up, right? I mean, and this is true in every life. I mean, nobody's irreplaceable, but you need to make sure as well that people can do different things in different situations.
Do you mind if I?
Yeah, please do.
So we saw this in spades when the cyber event happened, and it was really interesting because there were definitely individuals that came out of nowhere that all of a sudden rose up and they were doing amazing things and, you know, absolutely running the marathon of the event. But there were also people who, for whatever reason, and there's no right or wrong about it, it's just for whatever reason, they weren't able to handle that situation at that particular time. And one of the things that was a major takeaway for me was, how do you train for those types of situations? What if your people officer can't do the job at that point in time? What if your chief security officer just mentally can't be there? Maybe it's, you know, that they feel in that moment that it's their fault. And if it's their fault, maybe they just freeze and can't actually move forward. Now, I'm not saying that happened in our situation, but we did see very key individuals that just weren't capable of actually proceeding in that environment as it was. And I don't think you ever trained for that, and I think you should. I think you should train for that most critical person for that particular event to not be there. Because you never know if they will be or not, either physically or mentally. They may or may not be there. So train for that, and that's going to help build your resilience as an organization.
So the next question is probably the most uncomfortable for me, I think, as a leader. And that is, it's really struck me, I was talking with you, about the social contract you have with your people. You're going to put them in danger. You're going to put them into situations which they will find traumatic. You're going to put them in situations that will test their resilience beyond anything that's happened before. And how do you prepare? What's that conversation? How does that sort of social contract unfold?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to react to something that Carrie said as well on the impact on people, and also on, you know, one thing is training. I think it's also about planning. So just before I go to the social contract, I mean, I think one needs to be aware about the impact on people, and some of it, as you said, is very visible immediately, and then some of it will come much later. And so you need to, when the crisis is over, you also need to keep an eye on people afterwards, because even those who pull through, you know, fine or really tired, but you need to keep an eye on people after that as well, because the way it shows up could be very different for different people, and it can also become much later. And one part as well in terms of planning, and for example, one of the things that we do have for a crisis is that you plan ahead who's going to be in charge of the crisis and who's going to run the business. And these cannot necessarily be the same people. They need to be in touch, but it can't necessarily be the same people. It's also about having more people on hand. So we have people that have their normal day jobs and they're on rosters because they have a specific expertise that they can bring a language, or they're a lawyer, or they're a doctor, or what have you, or they have multiple skills, which we often need. We call them generalists, or polyvalent, as the French would say. So you have rosters where people know that, you know, their medical clearance is okay. I mean, they have everything in order to step up in 24 hours or in a week from now to either support teams that are going through this, or to replace people, or to rotating teams, because you never know how long the crisis is going to happen, so that, you know, 23 hours a day, you can hold that for a couple of days. Even people that work for the Red Cross, or even, you know, people in hospitals, they don't work 23 hours a day for 2 weeks in a row. I mean, you gotta take a rest. So you need shifts. You need to rotate people in and out. and they go back to their normal job, which also means that the bigger organization feels part of the response, which can be quite nice, by the way.
Just real quick, so
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting point because this rotation in business, you never practice. And you don't practice it because when you do a red teaming event or you do, a purple teaming event, whatever it is, it's a 24-hour exercise usually. It's not a 3-month, a 4-month, a 5-month exercise. So you never really even think about rotation. When we were in the event, what we found was there were critical skills that were required that either had no backup, so we actually had to have them working 24 hours a day, almost every day for weeks on end. And that's when we saw the breaking point and had to say stop. But we also realized at that point in time that we still needed these people on the front lines in the field because they were the experts. And so we had to start building in some strategies like 4-box breathing, for example, to help them get calm but still stay on the front, have enough adrenaline going that they could still stay on the front lines. And that was a big kind of leadership learning for me as well, because although I would have liked to have taken them out, I would have liked to have rotated, because we didn't plan for that, because we didn't know that that was going to be necessary, we weren't prepared for it. So I think what you're saying there, prepare for the rotation, prepare for the marathon, prepare for the length. When you're doing your exercises, don't just do it for 24 hours, because that's usually not the amount of time that these attacks are happening.
And the impact that they have over time. And I think it's an important point as well, whether that's for a business or a government or an organization like ours. Also, taking care of your people before, during, and after, it comes with a cost. And it's something that you need to invest in and you need to prioritize. It can't be an afterthought. One could say, well, the likelihood that this will happen is very low, but the return on investment when it does happen, and I think when you talk about cybersecurity incidents, they're happening every day, all the time, not always with that kind of impact, but there will probably be more and more and more often. Meaning as well, more often is that you get this crisis, and then you don't necessarily, by the time you get over it, the next one might be coming. A point as well that I wanted to make in planning before I move to the social contract is that often when organizations start, and we do this as well, right? We have checklists, and so you have procedures, and you have mechanisms, and you have a bunch of things, and this is really important to have those. But we need to remember that in a crisis moment, whether you're a leader or anybody else, you need to be able to make rapid judgment, right? It's these moments where you need to take big decisions with big consequences, and you need to make them fast. So there's 2 things I think you need to think about. One is you referred to command and control. And yes, and I sometimes compare it to being an emergency room, a surgeon, there's 4 surgeons, they're operating on you. I watch too much ER. But somebody needs to be in charge. However, that doesn't mean because I'm the boss, I know everything. So you need to be challenged. Correct. You need to have a critical friend in the room. You need to have somebody who's going to challenge you, who's going to bring diverse perspective. Maybe not necessarily from their own specific domain of expertise, but they will bring in, actually often not. Some of my tech colleagues say it's very good to have some people who know nothing about tech asking us questions, and I have the same. It's good for me to have tech people ask about the stuff that I know about, because it makes me think harder. So that's important, but it needs to also be clear that then somebody needs to have the final word. But just to have, not meaning that like I'm the boss, I know what I'm doing, because what if the boss falls out? By the way, you need to have a backup for the boss too. And the second point is common sense. So checklists can help, procedures can help, training can help, technology can help, by the way, but you have to be able to rely on your gut in those moments, and that you need to train your gut. And I use this example about, we all use a GPS to drive around, whether it's Waze or Google Maps or whatever that you have. But there's so many studies that have shown people driving through a tunnel under a mountain, and their GPS obviously doesn't get signal anymore. And so it'll go like, make a U-turn. And people make a U-turn in a tunnel. It happens to the best of us. And it's just saying that you need to train that. So, for us, it will mean like once in a while, maybe you should, try to find your way yourself rather than relying on the GPS, because the GPS might not be there. So you better be able to read a map or just think like, well, I came from there, so probably. So I think that common sense bit is very important as well. But I'm happy to talk about the social contract.
Yeah, let's get social
I know you're keen to talk about that. So it's a social contract, and it does come with a contract, right? I mean, we do get clauses in our contracts that say that you're going to be working in a war zone and you'll be at risk, and etc. But I think what's important is that you have to have a real conversation with people about that. From the day that they apply to work for you, to the recruitment process, through before a deployment to a specific situation, and throughout their life within the organization. It needs to be a real conversation where you take the time and you sit down and you're very plain, clear, not a lot of packaging, no sugar coating, no drama either, but saying like, well, you're going to work in a place where people get killed, where people get hurt, colleagues have been killed, have gotten hurt, have been held hostage. This is something that can happen. Now, you don't want to, get them into a panic, so our security measures are really good. We do a lot of contingency planning, security training. We have really good security measures, and we take it very, very serious, whether that's physical security or cybersecurity, by the way. But there is no such thing as zero risk. And as we said, the point here is not when things get really harder that we all leave. Now, if somebody needs to leave, that's okay. You need to know that you can walk away from this, but we will need to, replace you, etc. And then also say what it is that we're going to do to reduce that risk. What are we going to do to support you in this, to prepare you for this, to support you and your family when something's happening, when suddenly you need to be 24 hours on call for 3 weeks in a row, but your wife with a newborn baby is sitting at home. Or worse, when you're being held hostage or whatever. So it's kind of having that really very plain conversation. And the second thing is that's not a conversation you can have only once. You need to have it in several moments, but also over time. People change. They might get worn out by the stress, or they might actually step up because they get more and more experience and they're more comfortable with it. But people's lives change. Some of us have kids. Some of us, our parents are aging. Some of us had a partner that we could count on, and suddenly that partner is not there, either because they walked out on you or because they got sick or they died. And that changes people's capacity or willingness to take that risk. So it's also, keeping that conversation going. It's also not just a contract and a conversation, right? It comes with real organizational frameworks, and where we talked about contingency planning, rigorous training, risk management, clear protocols, during, after, etc. So I think this is very important because as a leader as well, your authority doesn't come from being the boss. In those moments. Maybe in other moments it does, but in those moments it doesn't. And people will follow you when you need to make those hard decisions and ask them to trust you. Ask them to do this and do it differently than they're used to it. They need to know that you, and they have that from that previous conversation, that you look at reality really hard, that you plan for it, that you're prepared for it, and that you told them that before. It creates a kind of trust. Hopefully, that will make that it's going to be easier for them to follow you as well.
So, Kerry,
Yeah.
does that feel like what we do in IT teams and cybersecurity teams?
It's not at all, right? We have no social contract with our employees in our business. It just doesn't exist today. And I think it should, because I think that in the first, and we had this conversation many times in the first couple of weeks, but every single partner, vendor, person that I spoke to, customer that I spoke to, the first thing they said to me when I called them and said, we've had a cyber attack, this is the situation, this is what it means to you, they said, Carrie, if it wasn't you, it'd be us. If it wasn't you, it'd be us. And there was a social contract of that, that, we're all in this together, but unfortunately it's you and it's not me, but I want to learn from you as to what's happening here. But then what was felt very strongly throughout the rest of the recovery, and I'm just going to be completely honest, that was August of last year, we're still in recovery. Recovery never ends after a cyber attack. It will never, ever end. And that social contract of what happens in those first 24 hours in the first 3 weeks, in the first 3 months, in the first 6 months, and then what people may feel 9 months later, that's never talked about. And I think it should be, because I do have people with PTSD. I do have people that have lost an enormous amount of weight because of the pressure. I do have people with endocytis and issues that started to propagate way after the recovery of the event was actually kind of said, signed and done by all of our cyber experts, and okay, you've now recovered. Well, have we really? Because you never do. It's always going to be a part of you. It's something that forever you're going to take with you in your next opportunity, in your next crisis. And that can be good and that can be bad. But I think that social contract, when we're doing our red teaming exercises, when we're having those one-on-one discussions, those quarterly reviews on an individual and on a corporate basis, I think those are real. What got us through the cyber attack at the end of the day was a very transparent communication. It was clear, it was consistent, and we were all kind of in it together. So, and let's be honest, I had never gone through a cyber attack. I was the CEO of the company. I didn't know what I was doing. And neither did my leadership team, and neither did anybody in the company. Even my, CISO had never actually had an attack happen. It's a very different experience from practicing it to actually being in the reality of it. And I do think these are some of the things that are important up front from a human perspective. That social contract, what does that mean? If we're able to recover in X amount of days, great. If we're not, then what? And what am I asking of you as an individual and as a company?
Now, I'm really aware we're getting tight out of time. We could talk for hours. It's just absolutely fascinating. So I think if there's just one thought you would leave with the audience here, what would it be? Maybe Els first.
Options, options, options. You have to have options. It will make everything easier. I would say prepare. Don't over-prepare. But you have to be prepared. I don't. This is more talking to my own. You have to prepare. You have to think these things through. But you also, as crisis moments repeat, and they will. It's also we need. So this is the thing. Simulation exercise are good. Because once you've already kind of done it before, even if you know it's fake, but make it real, make it a good simulation, not on a computer. For cybersecurity, you kind of have to do it on a computer, but make it really real life. Take a day away from it and do the simulation. Learn lessons. Take those lessons with you. Put them back into your preparation, your contingency planning, but also avoid the trap of we've been here before or I've been here before. I know what to do because I did it last time. Because every time is going to be different. And I think also I want to point on that because you mentioned that point about, the consequences afterwards on people, but also on leaders. And I think it's important that leaders also speak out that it's okay to fail. That doesn't mean you take your responsibility lightly, but, everybody's going to get it wrong at some point. And that's okay, as long as you're aware of it and you can learn from it. But also, this kind of post-event, maybe it's not always the PTSD, it can be smaller things, but that's part of the social contract too, and it's not a part that we've always had. It's very recent, even in an organization like ours, that we actually do this psychological support after time, and that we're saying, for example, it's still a taboo in the humanitarian sector to say people get burned out. We're all heroes, right? Everybody's like, wow. But, people get burned out. Or maybe not burned out, but they don't go well, and going to an organization that is about, that, and saying, I'm not feeling well, it's very hard to come out. So even that is part of the social contract. Tell us when you are. We're going to take care of you. That's important.
Kerry, one thing from you.
I'll be quick. Looks like there's 25 seconds on the clock, so I'll be quick. The one thing that I would like you to take away and remember is that a cyber attack, when it happens, has nothing to do with technology. It's all about humans. And humans are not what we prepare. They're not what we train for. So we prepare the technology, we get the resilience plan, we follow the NIST, we do all these things. And I'm not saying don't do those. Absolutely do those. But when the world goes dark, technology is non-existent. So when that happens, what do you have to rely on? And it is the humans in your company that you have to rely on. And you have to make sure that you're preparing them and you're making them as resilient as you are your systems.
Wow. Kerry, Els, your candidness and your experience is so powerful. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Will you please join me in thanking
You're
Kerry
welcome.
and Els.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Els. Thank you. Wow. So let me take you back to yesterday morning, and it was only yesterday. Me recounting my Florida journey in the storm. And what feels like the parallel for us in cybersecurity, of being in the perfect storm where technology disruption meets rising geopolitical tensions, causing tumultuous uncertainty. My overarching reflection of these 2 days is the real confidence we can all take from the community we have here, with such depth of experience, diversity of insight, and the absolute underpinning of our shared mission. All of us in the car, driving, navigating through that storm. The key thing for all of us leaving today is to recognize that we are in a moment, and we need to seize it. So before we go, just a huge thank you to all of our sponsors, especially our lead sponsors, Aretico and Scottish Power. Thank you to all our exhibitors, our speakers, our panelists. We've heard from international speakers from right across the world, so a huge thank you particularly to them for making the journey to join us, which hasn't been easy for some. And CyberUK isn't possible without a dedicated team that live and breathe the event all year round. Thank you to our events support company, Bray Lino Events, and to the team at the NCSC that have worked on the conference, in particular, the events team. And I want to say a huge thank you to the whole NCSC team, who I, every day, am so proud to represent. I'm excited to announce that CyberUK 2027 will be in Liverpool. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of today. Can't wait to see you in Liverpool next year. Thank you and safe travels.